cold December wind in Chicago snaked through every alley, carrying with it what seemed like an eternal flurry of tiny snowflakes. Evan Cole, 35, stood before the colossal window of his Aeronova office, his eyes following the airplanes taking off one after another. His eyes, normally sharp and decisive, now held a look of deep concern. The position of CEO he held, a symbol of the American dream, was being threatened by ghosts from the past. Prejudices he thought he had buried long ago. A few blocks away, in an apartment overlooking the shimmering expanse of Lake Michigan, an older man named Julian Reed sipped a glass of scotch, his eyes full of mockery. A picture of Evan on the cover of a business magazine lay on the table with the headline, "Evan Cole, Architect of the New Flying Era." Julian sneered gently, swirling his drink. "A new era, but people never change," he muttered. "Soon enough you'll realize just how fragile these new things are." Julian, a former Aeronova executive, had been outmaneuvered by Evan in the battle for the CEO position. He represented the old guard people who believed in traditional conservative values and despised Evan's too-fast changes. Julian had a very close relationship with Sarah Miller, a senior flight attendant. He had secretly approached her, promising a large bonus if she upheld the airline's tradition. Meanwhile, Sarah Miller, 48, was in her kitchen preparing dinner. In the industry, Sarah was known as a tough, meticulous woman who always demanded perfection. For her, the first-class cabin was not just a service. It was a world she had to protect. That world was built on elegance and sophistication, and those who belonged there had to have a matching appearance. She believed she was the keeper of tradition, while people like Evan Cole only brought chaos. Sarah had received a call from Julian promising her a hefty bonus if she maintained the standards and made things difficult for Evan. A flash of greed flickered in her eyes, but it quickly subsided. She believed she was doing the right thing, not for the money, but for the respect she had built over 20 years. That morning, Evan received an anonymous email. The email contained a confidential report on employee discrimination on Aeronova flights, particularly in the first-class cabins. This report had been intentionally ignored by Julian's faction on the board of directors. Reading every word, Evan's heart ached. Passenger X, an Asian-American man, was asked to move to the economy class because he didn't fit the luxurious atmosphere of the first-class cabin. Passenger Y, a middle-aged woman, was refused expensive wine service because she didn't look like she could appreciate it. Evan Cole quietly stood up and walked to the window. He could never forget when he was 25. After graduating with a master's in business, he applied to a prestigious airline. The interview went smoothly until the manager looked him up and down and said one thing: "We're not looking for this image." That sentence haunted him throughout his years of hard work, leading him to not only work in the aviation industry, but to eventually become the owner of an airline. He had always dreamed that Aeronova would be a place without prejudice, where everyone was treated equally. But this report showed that his dream was crumbling at his feet. He had to act not just for the company, but for his ideals. He decided to check for himself. No privileges, no bodyguards, no information about his identity. He would become an ordinary passenger like millions of others and see if he would be treated the same way. Evan wore a simple black t-shirt, jeans, and old sneakers. He didn't wear his glittering Rolex or an expensive suit. He wanted to know if his first-class seat would be replaced just because he didn't look like a billionaire. He booked a ticket for Aeronova Flight 227 from Chicago to Los Angeles using his real name. At the airport, Evan walked through the check-in area quietly. By chance, he stopped at a coffee shop and saw a middle-aged Asian-American man arguing with a flight attendant. The attendant said in a cold voice, "Sir, first class is not for passengers with too much carry-on luggage." The man looked annoyed. "I paid for this service. Besides, my luggage is well within the regulations." The flight attendant's attitude remained unchanged, and in the end, the man reluctantly walked away. Evan watched the man's retreating back, his heart heavy. This was exactly what he needed to change. He looked at his watch. There were 30 minutes until boarding. He walked slowly, but in his mind he was ready for an uneven battle. At the same time, trainee flight attendant Chloe Adams, 22, was preparing for her first flight. She knew this was one of the airline's most important flights, with several VIPs on board. She admired Sarah Miller, the famous chief flight attendant, but also felt there was something wrong with the way she worked. Chloe believed that serving customers should come from kindness, not discrimination. Meanwhile, Kevin Riley, a young flight attendant, was chatting with Sarah. "We have some special guests today," Kevin said. "Looks like Sarah will have to work her magic again." Sarah just gave a faint smile. She believed Kevin shared some of her personality. First class must be protected, she thought. Finally, Captain David Thompson, a man nearing retirement, was sitting in the cockpit. He didn't pay much attention to the flight attendant's trivial matters. His biggest concern was completing the flight safely and getting his retirement fund. He didn't want any trouble. However, he had a good relationship with Sarah. She had helped him out a few times, so he trusted her. All the characters had been placed in position like pieces on a chessboard. And the player, Evan Cole, was ready to begin this game, a game he could not afford to lose. The lights at gate B14 of O'Hare Airport flickered faintly on the polished floor. Evan Cole walked slowly, the friction of his sneakers against the tiles creating a dry, solitary sound amidst the noisy rush of hundreds of people. He wasn't wearing his Patek Philippe watch, nor his Brioni suit, and no bodyguards accompanied him. He was just an ordinary passenger, carrying an old backpack and a first-class ticket. His purpose wasn't to relax, but to test a hypothesis. Does the face of first class matter more than fairness? As he passed the duty-free shop, Evan saw Chloe Adams, the trainee flight attendant, talking to a ground staff member. Chloe was very young, her face filled with anxiety, yet also an indescribable eagerness. Her eyes swept over each passenger, perhaps trying to learn to recognize the familiar faces she had been told about. Evan glided past her. He sensed the young woman's inexperience, but also her enthusiasm, and wondered if she was part of the problem or part of the solution. Evan sat down on a chair near the boarding gate, observing silently. Groups of people streamed past him, forming a continuous flow of all social classes, ethnicities, and ages. He closed his eyes, and an old memory suddenly rushed back. That year he was 25, having just graduated with honors, with a master's in business administration. He applied to a prestigious airline, hoping to become part of the management team. The final interview took place in a luxurious room with a middle-aged, white-haired man sitting behind a mahogany desk. The conversation went well, until the man stood up, walked around the table, looked Evan up and down, and said with a faint smile, "We're not looking for this image, you know. Our airline emphasizes luxury elegance, and you lack those things." That sentence was like a knife plunged into the young man's passionate heart. He went home, looked in the mirror, and asked himself, what is the image of a CEO or a manager supposed to be? That memory became a fire that never went out. It was the motivation for him to work maniacally, taking every risk, to finally not only enter the aviation industry, but to become its leader. He had sworn he would never let anyone be treated that way again. However, the anonymous report on his desk showed that this vow was being violated within his own company. Evan opened his eyes and looked toward a middle-aged white couple, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, standing near the boarding gate. They were dressed splendidly, holding glasses of champagne and laughing happily with Sarah Miller, the chief flight attendant. Sarah nodded, gave a promising smile, and gestured toward the first-class cabin. It seemed she had something arranged. Suddenly, Evan felt a strong urge to move closer. It was time for him to check. In the cockpit, Captain David Thompson was performing his final equipment checks. He was a veteran pilot with nearly 30 years of experience, and he had only 2 more flights until his official retirement. He had been dreaming of his days of leisure fishing and playing golf. He didn't care much for the small squabbles of the cabin crew as long as they didn't affect the flight. However, before heading into the cockpit, he had received a call from Sarah. She had told him about some hiccups with the passenger list and asked him to lend a hand if anyone caused trouble. He had agreed, seeing it as a small favor for an old colleague. As the flight began to board, Evan remained calm. He stepped onto the jet bridge, his first-class ticket in hand. He was no longer Evan Cole, the CEO of Aero Nova, but just an ordinary man who wanted to be treated fairly. Would he receive that? Or would he have to face the very prejudice he had fought against his entire life? The experiment had begun. Stepping into the first-class cabin, Evan Cole immediately felt the distinct difference. The silent, luxurious space enveloped him, completely separated from the noise of the economy section. The scent of new leather, the soft golden lighting, and the soothing classical music created an opulent atmosphere. However, that tranquility was quickly shattered as he approached seat 2A, the one he had booked. "Sir, I believe you are in the wrong cabin." The cold, condescending voice of Sarah Miller, the chief flight attendant, rang out. She blocked his path, her eyes sizing him up with unconcealed disdain. Her neat chignon and perfectly ironed uniform couldn't hide the arrogance that emanated from her every gesture. "No, I'm certain I'm not," Evan replied, his voice surprisingly calm. He held out his boarding pass, which clearly stated seat 2A. Sarah merely glanced at it, not bothering to take it. She raised an eyebrow, a challenging faint smile on her lips. "That seat has been reassigned. We have important guests who need it." From behind Sarah, another young flight attendant, Kevin Riley, approached. He was tall with a slightly haughty posture. He smirked, looking at Evan as if he were a strange object. "That's right, buddy," he said. "First class isn't for everyone. Looking at you, the economy cabin is probably a better fit." Kevin's words were like a knife stabbing into Evan's old wound. A hot sensation surged in his chest. However, he had trained himself for too long to be provoked by such remarks. He remained composed, looking directly into Sarah's eyes, the eyes of a leader who was all too familiar with dealing with dissenters. "I paid for this seat. I demand to be seated in my correct position." Just then, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson, a lavishly dressed couple, walked up. They represented the elite class that Sarah always wanted to please. She flashed a completely different sweet smile and bowed ceremoniously. "Welcome, sir and madam. Your seats are ready." The Hendersons looked at Evan with curiosity. "What's going on, Sarah?" Mr. Henderson asked, holding a glass of champagne she had offered him. "Nothing at all, sir. Just a minor misunderstanding with a passenger," Sarah replied, then turned back to Evan with a cold stare. "Please, Mr. Henderson, take your seat." Evan said nothing. He simply sat down in seat 2A and didn't move. He wanted to see what they would do. His action infuriated Sarah. She pulled out her phone and called Captain David Thompson. David, an older man on the brink of retirement, wanted to avoid all trouble. He emerged from the cockpit, his face grim and annoyed. "What's the matter, Sarah? I'm busy." "Captain, we have a disruptive passenger," Sarah said, pointing at Evan. "He refuses to leave his seat, even though he was informed it had been reassigned." David looked at Evan, then at his simple clothes. He cleared his throat, trying to sound authoritative. "Sir, if you don't comply, we will be forced to ask you to deplane. This flight cannot be delayed for a minor issue like this." In the back, 2 young passengers, Ethan and Sophia, had witnessed everything. They were a couple of travel bloggers with a small but enthusiastic YouTube channel. Ethan took out his phone and started recording. Did you see that, Sophia? This is exactly what people complain about on social media. Sophia nodded her face, showing indignation. He's just wearing normal clothes, and he's being treated like this. It's disgusting. She pulled out her tablet and posted a status update. Witnessing discrimination on Aeronova Flight 227. His name is... Well, he hasn't said his name. Chloe Adams, the trainee flight attendant, stood at the back of the cabin watching the entire spectacle. Her heart pounded. She had been trained that all passengers must be treated fairly. She knew Evan was completely in the right. She clutched her phone tightly. She remembered a friend who used to work for the airline and was fired for going against a superior's wishes. Chloe was scared, but her conscience wouldn't let her stay silent. She discreetly turned on her phone's voice recorder and slipped it into her pocket. Is this how Aeronova treats its passengers? Evan asked, his voice still calm but full of authority. He pulled out his identification card and his premium business card. I can prove my identity. Sarah looked at Evan's matte black card, then burst into a mocking laugh. Oh, do people like you carry fake cards now? This outfit and this card, they don't match at all. Evan's eyes darkened. The old pain returned once again. He remembered the face of the old airline manager. He had tried to change things, but it seemed prejudice was still there, hidden deep within people like Sarah. He pulled out his phone and called Rachel Grant, his assistant. Rachel, take note. Inform the board of directors we're about to have a major situation. I want them to follow all developments on this flight. The Hendersons settled into Evan's seat, a triumphant smile on their faces. They winked at Sarah as if this were a privilege she had granted them. Kevin whispered to Sarah, "Who does he think he is? Must be a scammer." Sarah sneered. Look at his clothes. First class isn't a shabby black t-shirt. Chloe at the back of the cabin heard everything. She gripped her phone tightly. She knew what she had to do, but she also knew she was at a crucial crossroads in her career. Would she choose to become an excellent flight attendant like Sarah, or a conscientious one in her own way? The struggle of one man had turned into the struggle of many. Flight 227 from an ordinary flight had become a stage, and everyone was waiting to see where this play would go. The silence of the first-class cabin was broken by Sarah's scornful laughter. That laugh wasn't just mockery, but an expression of the power she believed she held. Her eyes scanned Evan's black card, his name engraved on it, but she saw it only as a ridiculous fake. There are many fake cards, Sarah said, her voice filled with contempt. Just a few dollars online, but what about your appearance? Who do you think you can fool a man like you? Those words were not just an insult, but a personal attack striking directly at Evan's old wounds. A hot sensation surged in his chest, but he had trained himself for too long to be provoked. He looked directly into Sarah's eyes, the eyes of a leader who was all too familiar with dealing with dissenters. He said nothing, simply calling his assistant Rachel Grant. Rachel, take note, he said, his voice eerily calm. Inform the board of directors we're about to have a major situation. I want them to follow all developments on this flight. Evan's voice was loud enough for Sarah, Kevin, and even Captain David Thompson to hear. They exchanged worried glances. David Thompson, who had spent nearly 30 years in the profession, only wanted a smooth flight. He looked at Evan, then at Sarah, and felt something was wrong. Sarah, could there be a mistake? Have you checked the system? Sarah quickly reassured the captain. No, Captain, I've checked. This passenger's name is not on our list. She had deleted Evan's name from the system as soon as she saw him board the plane. Chloe Adams, the trainee flight attendant, stood at the back of the cabin witnessing everything. Her heart pounded. She had seen Evan check in and his ticket confirmed as valid. She gripped her phone tightly. She remembered a friend who used to work for the airline and was fired for going against a superior's wishes. Chloe was scared, but her conscience wouldn't let her stay silent. She discreetly turned on her phone's voice recorder and slipped it into her pocket. She knew she was at a crucial crossroads in her career. Would she choose to become an excellent flight attendant like Sarah, or a conscientious one in her own way? Meanwhile, Ethan and Sophia, the two travel bloggers, had filmed and uploaded the video to YouTube and TikTok. "This is discrimination," Ethan whispered to Sophia. "A man treated like this just because he's wearing normal clothes." Sophia nodded, her face showing indignation. "Not only is he being treated badly, but they're also lying about deleting his name from the system. This is deception." Their words, though quiet, were vivid evidence exposing the truth. Evan maintained his calm demeanor, sitting in seat 2A and not moving. He wanted to see what they would do. His action infuriated Sarah. She turned to Kevin, whispering, "Who does he think he is? A low-level scammer?" Kevin smirked. "He'll be off this plane soon enough." The Hendersons settled into Evan's seat, a triumphant smile on their faces. They winked at Sarah as if this were a privilege she had granted them. Mr. Henderson said, "Sarah, well done. People like this shouldn't be here." Evan's eyes darkened. The old pain returned once again. He remembered the face of the old airline manager. He had tried to change things, but it seemed prejudice was still there, hidden deep within people like Sarah. The struggle of one man had turned into the struggle of many. Flight 227, from an ordinary flight, had become a stage, and everyone was waiting to see where this play would go. This conflict wasn't just between Evan and the flight attendants. It was also a struggle between old conservative values and new fair values. Sarah and David represented those who believed that the image of first class must be maintained at all costs, regardless of the truth. In contrast, Evan, Chloe, Ethan, and Sophia represented a new generation, those who believed that fairness and respect were core values. Could Evan win this fight? Could he change a culture that had existed for decades? Or would he have to accept defeat and give up on his dream? The answer would soon be revealed. The first-class cabin of Flight 227 suddenly became a silent battlefield, where the quiet was more terrifying than noise. Evan Cole remained still, his eyes devoid of emotion, yet strangely sharp. He stared at Sarah, who was trying to maintain her composure, but whose hands had begun to tremble. Kevin still stood there, his arrogant smile gone, replaced by a look of extreme confusion. Captain David Thompson, who had spent his life mastering the skies, now felt completely out of control. "Sir, this is your final warning." David Thompson said, his voice no longer authoritative, but trembling. "If you do not leave, we will have to call security to board the plane." Evan stood up, but not to leave. He faced David, his eyes full of defiance. "I suggest you wait another 5 minutes." "Why?" David asked, his voice full of skepticism. "Because in 5 minutes," Evan said, his voice lowering with authority, "you will receive a call from the person who pays your salary." That statement stunned everyone in the first-class cabin. Sarah, Kevin, and David all looked at each other, not understanding what was happening. From the back, Chloe Adams, the trainee flight attendant, came forward, clutching her phone tightly. She took a deep breath, as if summoning all her courage. "Captain, I think you need to hear this. This passenger's name was confirmed as valid in the system. I witnessed it. And I also recorded Sarah and Kevin's conversation, in which they admitted to intentionally deleting his name from the list." Chloe's words were like a bomb exploding, shattering the tense atmosphere. Sarah turned around, her eyes full of fury. "You're lying. You had no right to record us." "Yes, I did." Chloe replied, her voice unwavering. But what you did was far more wrong. You deliberately discriminated against and deceived a passenger. Meanwhile, Ethan and Sophia's videos on TikTok and YouTube went viral at an astonishing speed. There were thousands of comments and tens of thousands of shares. Aero Nova needs to respond, one comment said. This is the worst discrimination I've ever seen. Another person wrote. The public pressure had begun to spread into the cabin. Other passengers who had initially only watched now began to speak up. He bought a ticket, why should he have to leave? A woman said. You can't treat people like that just because they dress differently, another man added. Captain David Thompson, who always believed he could control everything, now felt his power slipping away. He turned to look at Sarah, his eyes filled with disappointment. Sarah, what have you done? Sarah, who had always been so proud of her professionalism, now had no words. She turned to look at Kevin, her eyes wide with panic. Kevin, what should we do? Kevin, who had always sided with Sarah, was now visibly flustered. He could only stand there watching his career crumble before his very eyes. Evan's call to the board of directors had a result. Rachel Grant, his assistant, called him back. Her voice was clear through Evan's earpiece. The board has held an emergency meeting. They have reviewed all the evidence. They have given you full authority to make the final decision. Evan gave a faint smile. He stood up facing Sarah, Kevin, and David. I gave you an opportunity to back down, but you didn't. No, Sarah stammered. It was just a misunderstanding. We can explain. Explain what? Evan asked, his voice chillingly calm. Explain how you deceived a passenger. Explain how you deleted my name from the system. Explain how you discriminated against me just because I was wearing a t-shirt. I am Evan Cole, he said, his voice echoing through the first-class cabin. The CEO of Aero Nova. And I, along with the board of directors, have witnessed the entire incident. All of you from Sarah Miller to Kevin Riley and Captain David Thompson are fired. Evan's words were like a bolt of lightning. Sarah collapsed into her seat, her face ghostly white. Kevin stood there completely lost. Captain David Thompson, who had spent nearly 30 years in the profession, now felt like he was no longer a pilot. We will be summoning a new crew to continue the flight. Evan said, his voice full of power. The three of you get off this plane immediately. Evan's words brought the drama to a close. One man's struggle had ended in a resounding victory, but this was only the beginning of a revolution within Aero Nova. Flight 227 did not take off on time, but in the first-class cabin not a single passenger complained. Instead of frustration, an atmosphere of satisfaction and justice being served enveloped everyone. As Sarah, Kevin, and David Thompson were led off the plane, their arrogance had completely vanished, replaced by humiliation and disbelief. They couldn't fathom that a man in a t-shirt and jeans could be the one to sign their termination notices. Evan Cole stood in the cabin watching their figures disappear. He turned to face the passengers. Their eyes no longer held curiosity or tension. Instead, they were filled with admiration and gratitude. He walked over to Chloe Adams, the trainee flight attendant, who was still trembling from what had just happened. Chloe, he said, his voice full of warmth. Thank you. You did the right thing. I just did what I believed was right, Chloe replied, tears beginning to fall. She hadn't thought she would have the courage to do it, but her conscience wouldn't let her stay silent. Evan smiled. Thank you. Aero Nova needs people like you. He turned to Linda Walsh, the security staff member who had stood there confused and hesitant. Linda, he said, you had the opportunity to do the wrong thing, but you didn't. That was the right choice. Linda bowed her head, her voice full of remorse. I hesitated. I was scared, but I couldn't do it. Because of that, Evan said, you will not be fired. You will be retrained, and you will be working under Chloe's supervision. Linda looked at Chloe with a mixture of surprise and respect. Evan turned back to the passengers. He stood in the middle of the cabin, clearing his throat to get everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Evan Cole, the CEO of Aeronova. I apologize for the recent incident. We will ensure that something like this never happens again. A small round of applause broke out. An elderly woman stood up. Thank you, Evan, she said. My son was once treated the same way. You did the right thing. Evan simply nodded, offering a faint smile. No one has to look rich to be treated like a human being. At that moment, Rachel Grant called back. Her voice was full of excitement. Evan, the videos on social media are spreading like wildfire. The hashtag #AeroNovaTruth is trending. Now is the time for us to make an official statement. Evan smiled, his voice full of determination. All right, let's do it. We won't hide anything. We will face the truth and make a change. Finally, Flight 227 took off. Although it was 2 hours late, no one was upset. Everyone knew they had witnessed something great. Evan sat back down in seat 2A, looking out the window. He was no longer a CEO trying to handle a crisis, but just an ordinary man who had stood up for what was right. This flight was not just a journey from Chicago to Los Angeles, but also a journey toward a better future for Aeronova. He knew this was only the beginning. The cultural revolution within the company would be difficult, but he had new allies, Chloe, Linda, and the millions of passengers who had stood up for him. And most importantly, he had regained his belief in himself that he could change the world.